I am so excited for this talk. Reggie James is, amongst other things, a friend and the CEO of Eternal, where I'm on the board. So we get to work together. We had a board meeting this week that was so special. And I got to know Reggie actually through his writing. And it was a really wonderful way to get to understand the way that he thinks about how culture and technology intersect. And I wanted to invite him to kind of expand on one of his pieces about why the US needs a creative director. And he was like, yes, absolutely. And there's an amazing person that I've gotten to know through the internet, which we love, Eugene Angelo, who's based in London, who is running a design studio called Angelo and working across kind of music, fashion, and technology, and was making the case that Mars also needed a creative director. And so his idea was to kind of be in conversation with Eugene and kind of talk about this need that they both identify. So without further ado, Reggie and Eugene, welcoming you guys to the stage.
Yo.
That was actually absurd. Cut that out.
In sync.
Very in sync. So, as always, when you go into album mode, you like to change the title right before the launch. So the new title is This Could Still Be a Movement, and that was inspired by many texts between Eugene and I. And so we're about to really dive into the future of creative directing Mars and what that means and why that's important and why it's also extremely not a joke. Just off the bat, Mars is an image, and we have to understand what image does, what Mars really is, everything that goes into understanding the components of that. And to energize the post-internet global project is a real understanding of scale. And I think being in Silicon Valley, there's just a real understanding of scale and what that allows to propel in terms of work, and also all of the beautiful byproducts of that. So an image equals a new horizon, equals a space for action, a collective game plan, and new story arc initiated. Why don't you talk a little on story arc?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of our conversations over the last few days has really been around how to really break the apathy that I think we're currently experiencing, especially in youth culture. And I think that's largely to do with the lack of images to really truly energize people. And so when we talk about Mars, we're not actually, we're sort of semi-serious, maybe in 10, 20 years, we'll be going out there and there will be creative decisions there being made. And it's important that we think about those creative decisions. But for the most part, Mars is really, it's a point of inspiration. It's sort of direction to move in. So there's a kind of framework for understanding what we mean really by images, which is that an image is kind of like a boat. We're leaving an island, which is the sort of current era that we're in. And the boat is the means of getting to that next place. So it's not an end, it's a means to an end. And so what we need to sort of make sure we do is sort of get on a boat and leave this island, because if we're continuously staying on the island, we'll overpopulate it, we'll sort of ravage it for all that it has. Humanity has to keep moving forward with new images and keep building new boats. And so we can kind of get a broad view throughout history of how this takes us up to today, which is that I think the last boat that we sent out was the boat of globalization as a sort of grand image and a human project that was sort of super ambitious and got us out of essentially a kind of early industrial period Europe. And so that sort of grand image of globalization, which sort of everything associated with that, kind of modernity, modernism, later on, Silicon Valley, I think has the kind of tail end of this movement, has brought us to this sort of present day, which is 2020 being, I think 2020 was our key reference of when that image died, which is kind of an interesting part, which is once an image becomes real, once what we've thought about becomes truly manifested and is our current reality, the image is dead. We're at the island. There's no longer a boat that we're getting on. There's no direction anymore. And so the sort of danger of being there for too long, as we said, is like ultimately stagnation and sort of utilizing, using that island too much, like just really festering there. And we need to sort of keep moving. I think that's integral to how we kind of preserve a good balance of optimism in the human consciousness. So yeah, this is kind of a broad view. And I think 2020 specifically was this real moment where you really sensed that globalization had peaked as a concept, in that our sort of supply chains had sort of started to break down. We were now like truly like densely connected through the internet. Everyone had to adopt Zoom and everything else. So it really felt like the image, this grand project of let's connect the world, let's create a global standard, that was truly complete at that moment. Here's a good example of that on a kind of more specific level, which is this Apple advert from, I think, 1987, so it's about 35 years old now. I think what's interesting about this image is that it's now like our reality today, and you can look at every detail in this image, and it's sort of very deliberate. It's not a fluke. Like there's a bed in the corner. It's about the proximity of work to sleep and leisure. You see art in the corner. You see a picture of the guy's family in the background. He's not wearing a suit, which is like a really key detail in 1987, I think. He's like got a cat. It's like a bit of companionship in there. Like there's a whole lot of details in there. Proximity to the city, sort of prospect refuge of sort of having the grand overview of the city. There's everything in here is sort of it's a vision. It's an image. And I think something interesting about images, not just on a broad scale of how we kind of like create trajectories for humanity, is that images are really the basis of companies too. And I think one insight we've had is that hardware companies like Apple, computing companies, the real innovation we think is actually in the image. And the real hard work is in making that image real. That's where this sort of technical innovation, where the real hours go in. But this vision is what really condenses all of that and drives it forward. And I think a lot of people have their own theories on this, but I guess like people who say Apple might be like stagnating or have kind of reached their peak I think that's because ultimately this image they created 35 years ago has become real. And that's a great achievement. But it means they haven't set out a new boat. And so we can reapply that back to, I guess, humanity on a broad scale. But interestingly, like it goes back to even how sort of an ambitious person lives their life, right? It's like, you set out a kind of grand ambition or goal that you see for yourself. And once you're there, you kind of like feel a bit like ripped off. It's like, oh, okay, I'm here now. Like it doesn't really. It's all about setting off new boats, essentially.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I think I guess what's key is like Mars is not the island we're going to. Mars is the boat. It's a vehicle for thought. It's a vehicle for moving forward. It's not necessarily the destination.
Right. And having that image in like reference to scale of where we are now is the key. And so in that point of once you've achieved that image, you kind of have this sinking feeling that it's over. This quote from Elias Canetti, I think, really solves what we're discussing. And so a crowd exists as long as it has an unattained goal. The image is acquired, and there is nowhere else to go. Setting off images allows crowds to condense their energy somewhere. This book, Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti, is like one of the most important books I think is disgustly like non-existent within like tech discourse, and yet it exists as like we were saying, like these vehicles for movement and community, and the distinction between those and where we get to once we've kind of landed there. And in this image equals unattained goal equals crowd. Crowd is what scale is. And now I think what we're experiencing a lot is the dispersing of scale into decentralization and all these things that are kind of crumbling at the bits, like you said before. But I think what's really exciting about new images is that we can learn from the previous ones. On the previous slide with the graphic, we were looking at kind of 1800s and the European migration. I think a very big critique is people thinking as Mars as like some colonization dream. But the really nice thing is that there's no one there. You know, the European story is one of coming over to land that there were people there. You know what I mean? And so there's ramifications upon ramifications of what that produced industrially and what it produced also from a Eurocentric, white-centric viewpoint of industry, society, beauty. And what's exciting about Mars is that none of that is there. Therefore, we have to think about where our spawn point is. And our spawn point is the internet, which is a hyper-global, intercultural, colorful experience that at scale is larger than any one nation. It's very post-nation state. So this key point is that the image has to be larger than the origin. And I think because we have probably the largest image today, which is the internet and globalization, what happens is any new work, any image that is smaller than that, it kind of just gets sucked up into that hall of mirrors. And so I like to use the analogy of mirrors because the internet and technology serve as these great reflection points back to who we are as individuals. And what gets really frustrating for a lot of people with the internet, I think, is that they see themselves so often and their flaws with nowhere else to put that energy. And so when you get stuck in that mirror of looking at self and kind of like the flaws, we have culture wars, we have more culture wars, essentially. And this is why Mars as an image is the only thing really larger than the internet right now and this mass global unified sense of self.
Yeah, and I think like what a story arc really is it's a sort of trajectory. It's this like huge buildup of momentum. You can't just go from a sort of horizontal like point A to point B. It has to be this summit that we're reaching for. And so I think that's the key point really is like what is sufficiently big enough of an image relative to the origin point being the internet, which is already such a vast thing. Like what is sufficiently big enough that we get this overall like summit feeling and this sensation of really needing to like push for something. I think that's the issue right now, especially on the internet, when we think of like the kind of we think of like the sort of modern crises that we're facing, is that with the internet as the sort of spawn point, the origin point, none of it is really big enough. Like it's a sort of terrible thing to think about, but like climate change as a story, the idea of solving climate change as a story arc is not, it actually is it's a regression from something as large as the internet. So we need to think way bigger to actually start to solve those problems and sort of collectivize people. An example of this really is just in individual people. Like people resonate with origin stories where someone starts from a local town or a city and reaches the global mass market. And these are the stories that we use to kind of orient our identities and cultures. And so it's really about thinking about this on a mass kind of global scale, just to hammer home that point. Mars is the only image big enough. Open to suggestions, but I think it might be the only one for now. I think there's other things, but we'll see. So yeah, it's the way to mobilize us to think bigger and break through this apathy. I think we call it like Apathy Island. It's like the Hall of Mirrors on the internet is Apathy Island. It's nothing is big enough to really motivate us to go and build a boat and set something else off.
Yeah. The Apathy Island, I think, is the thing that when we think what it means to be a creative technologist is what we have to break. And when we're not producing images that are in that resonant interval, I think we actually just exacerbate the problem. And so for like a bit of critique, the main image to keep on the environmentalism is kind of Greta yelling at adults. That doesn't really inspire any sort of movement towards solving that issue. And then you even get kind of, let's just say, their global peers of youth then adding to kind of like the critique of that image itself. And in creating that larger image, you kind of create the ability to solve these very big things that we view as issues as kind of like the byproduct of our movement. And that it's hard to say like, oh, environmental like solving is a byproduct. Yes, like it's just a yes, and that's also, we see that throughout history. Like the byproduct of World War II is computing. You know what I mean? And so when you start to take that historical example, you understand how true that image structure really is.
Yeah, so I guess what we're kind of, the crux of what we're saying here is really like, Instead of focusing on issues directly, focus on the thing that it's going to collectivize people best. Focus on the story arc, the thing that is going to really give people a sense of collective purpose first. And just by virtue of bringing people together in a more positive, optimistic way, we'll create byproducts that will solve those problems. I think what's important point is like this isn't about utopia. This isn't utopian thinking. It would be utopian thinking if we were saying Mars was the final destination, but it absolutely isn't. Mars will probably be bad too. I mean, there'll be bad things there. We'll fuck it up. Like it's not going to be amazing, but the point is to launch a boat off from there as well. Just keep moving. You know, that's like the real premise. And I think as long as we never sort of sit around on one island for too long, we'll be all right. Yeah. Mars is the image driving creation. I think what's important to think about Mars as a thought vehicle is that we can sort of start to imagine like, okay, what would we put up there? And we can think outside of the systems that really hinder our thinking on Earth. So when we think, I mean, we'll go into a whole set of design principles that we can use for like, you know, actually building things there. But you know, ultimately, it's really important to just think beyond our current systems right now. Yeah, we got some kind of starting points for like anyone who wants to start thinking about this stuff.
These are for the kids, you know.
Yeah, like go and make whatever. But these are some sort of key like ideas that we think, based on the sort of mistakes of the last image,
right,
we can move forward and we can learn from those mistakes. So I think the first thing was like this idea of a sort of post-true self era. I think one thing I say a lot is that the sort of real disease of the Western world is the idea of the true self. I think the true self is kind of it's the sort of idea that is foundational to the current consumerist economy that we're in, which is that it's basically the carrot on the end of the stick, which is like, you know, as soon as we might consume this thing and get slightly closer to our idea of what we want to be, it's all about ego formation. And I think we're kind of locked in this type of economy because it's so profitable, right? But I think Mars is actually an opportunity to reorient our economy around fluid and sort of ever-changing identity and the removal of identity as a fixed construct. Yeah. And I actually think that is a more abundant economy than the one we're in now, because we have to think about how much creative restriction there is due to something not fitting the criteria we have of who we are, and how much we sort of don't feel comfortable with being something because maybe it doesn't fit our image of ourselves, or, you know, not creating something because it doesn't fit our image of ourselves, or not collaborating with someone because they don't fit into our criteria of who we believe we are and who we're supposed to hang out with or work with. You know, the amount of creation and sort of withheld energy that results from, you know, the idea of the fixed self is actually a really big problem. And I think we should think about it as, you know, like, to put it in like very Silicon Valley terms, like multi-identity era is like multi-trillion-dollar opportunity.
So post-nation state, post-language, you know, Mars and the vehicle of thought that is Mars is going to look far more like a string of Vatican cities tied to Singapore's than it is going to look like, you know, the United States plot on Mars with the Little Italy next to the like Tokyo town next to, you know, the barbershop. Like those aren't the structures that we're going to like orient that spatiality around. And when you then think about what it means to be post-nation state, post-language, and you take that mirrored view, you really start to look at things like immigration reform very differently. And you start to see how real silly some of these things that we put up are. And so taking, again, this vehicle for thought of what does it mean to be post-nation state on Mars allows you to think about what it means to be post-nation state right now, and all the generative opportunities, the trillion dollar, you know, dollar signs above our heads right now.
I think like what's important here too is like this isn't about removing cultural nuance. It's not about removing the richness of language or the richness of culture. It's about kind of reorienting, I guess, our borders around things that aren't violent. I mean, the current issue really is that you know, culture and language is reinforcing a kind of violent border that you know, excludes, restricts people. You know, the purpose of a border should be to appreciate the flavor of one place from the other. You know, that should be what it does. It should remind us of the beauty of nuance. the richness of the world, right?
Yeah,
It shouldn't
boundaries
be
are us crossing over to experience the new center point.
Yeah.
But it's not the dividing line.
Yeah, it shouldn't be. I think we need to sort of move past borders as a sort of tool for like economic exclusion and ultimately barriers to occupational mobility. I think that's and yeah, as you said, it's like by thinking about these things in the form of images and the form of ideas that we can just make, produce, mock up. We actually start to now think like, wait, what if we just brought that here? What if we applied that here? And then we get those byproducts that we're talking about.
Yeah, post monoculture. I mean, this is the important thing to understand. Like, now that the island we're on is this post-globalist island and we're on the internet, there is really no excuse for a monoculture thinking. I think being in SF giving this talk is a really interesting one, particularly just from our conversation this morning, which is San Francisco is really kind of built on this idea. The reason why there's so many tech products for tech people, right? And there's this really interesting phrase that every company is going to be a tech company. And I think part of the reason that phrase got proliferated was because tech people are really good at selling things to tech people. So if everything is a tech company and everyone is a tech worker, then we expand our market exponentially. But I think what that does is really reinforce that monoculturist thinking versus the fluid one from the worlds that Eugene and I come from, which is music and fashion and just kind of street in general. And allowing yourself to be that kind of post-monoculture structure really, again, opens you up to the same thing that allows for post-nation state. It's a beauty of what else is on the other side without it having to be a hard division or a sense of violence.
Yeah, and like ultimately like learning from the mistakes of the last image, which was like it originated in like Europe. It's a sort of very like specific image that suits a very specific type of person. And I think the beauty of the internet as the origin point is we don't have to make that mistake again. We can in theory, and we absolutely should have this as a priority, involve everyone in that conversation about what that next image is, where we're going. This is like another really key thing. This sort of relates to the idea of like what a creative director is, which is like, a creative director, it's a sort of funny term because it got really co-opted by like every kid on earth over the last like 10 years. But creative director is like, they summarize a broader culture. I think that's what's important. Like there's a broader culture that exists. A creative director ultimately sort of understands what that culture is about, knows the key references, and is able to summarize it for an outside market that doesn't necessarily have the time to appreciate that broader culture for its full nuance, but does have the time to experience it through the sort of condensed lens of the creative director. I think creative directors as a job, like it's to do with simplifying the world where we don't have the time and capacity to understand everything. So when we think about like what the creative director version 1 is, it's like a lot of people taking credit for broader cultures and kind of like, sort of eliminating those large groups of people that play a part in something. We don't want to be involved in that. We're not about that. Like this is more about open referencing and actually like we call it kind of a layer approach, which is that like everything that you make should point in the direction of the reference or something else that's going to take you deeper. So that at least like if you don't have the time, you can stop there. But if you are curious, you can go deeper. You can find more things.
It's big ecosystem versus ecosystem,
Yeah,
which I think is a really good like slide from yesterday.
Yeah,
right?
Shout out that.
Yeah. Shout out Baukunst. But like no reference point to go off of. That's ecosystem. That's I am the synthesizer. Therefore, you consume me, and I give purpose to your identity. Ecosystem is I'm showing you every line that I pulled from, and I'm giving you access to every single person. One of our favorite talks is Tremaine Emory, A-Side, Heron, and Virgil. And it's because you really realize it's not Virgil just being Virgil. It's Virgil in community with his peers and driving reference from their peers and everything that goes off to. I think there's a really big myth of like the genius founder. The genius founder, while be it there are some exceptional people, is always about the like 80 people that actually allowed something to materialize, and not allowing that reference and those lines being drawn in the ecosystem has been, again, one of the failures of kind of the current state of what it means to produce.
Yeah, I think also like the world that I come from, specifically like making T-shirts and album covers. It's like I think a lot of what I saw was ultimately not pointing in the direction of something deeper. And I think a lot of kids are in that situation where, you know, ultimately they're just not being, their curiosity, they have unlimited curiosity, but really are not being given the codes. And I think what's key to this is just always pointing to something else, always putting you on to something that is, if you have that curiosity, you can go deeper. And then again, we'll get more nuance. We'll get more creative directors, because there'll be more people with more knowledge. There'll be more people who can create these images and do it well too, and not just like be derivative. And that's the real issue. Is, you know, if there's no images that people have been pointing in, no reference points, people are just looking at surface stuff all day, and they're just going to keep making surface stuff. So, in the spirit of that, we've put a Figma document that we did for this talk up here, maybe on like the YouTube or whatever. You can zoom in. These are some key references. Edouard Glissant, who, like, you know, incredible philosopher who has this idea of opacity and really like has thought deeply about fluid identity and ever-changing. One quote that he had is that utopia is accepting the thought and richness of change, which I think is a beautiful premise. And then we have Virgil Abloh and Rem Koolhaas hat right there, which I think is also, you know, these are brilliant image makers. These are people that set out images that inspired generations, and I think we're really trying to push that forward.
Yeah, I think one thing on the
This is us designing the slides.
Yeah, we were getting kicked out of this cafe, and the slides weren't done, and I was texting Kay, and I was like, yo, we need more time. But on the previous image, I think one thing that's really sick about that hat is just that on the Rem Koolhaas side, that's a reimagining of the European flag, and on the Virgil side is the Black American flag. And I think what's really powerful of that, and thinking about the immigration story that is, you know, Europe to Americas and the forming of America and what that represents, and then to invert that and put a new universal Europe and then a Black America. I think that symbolism is kind of what the mass immigration experience of Mars will be. And I think all of humanity needs to kind of go through a sort of mass immigration experience to really kind of reframe who we are and the people that we probably haven't treated as strong as we should have had. And that's what it means to be an image maker in a lot of ways.
Bar. Okay, so yeah, like some places to start from. We just like wrote down a bunch of ideas, but you know, like insert thing on Mars here, like, you know, have fun with it, right? And like what's funny is, you know, we've just like played around with these ourselves and like kind of reached new conclusions about, you know, based on the principles we put forward earlier, like things that are actually, you know, deeply relevant and would really transform things on this planet. So yeah, shout out Mars.
Yeah, I think if we
Tell us your favorite ones.
Yeah, tell us your favorite ones, design it, use Midjourney, send it to us. And yeah, I think this is a good space for questions or for any probe, if we have any space for that. I'll come closer to you.
Hey, I was curious, I'm not sure if you went back to take a historical look at how the image of the internet and globalization emerged, because there's also this process of competing and almost evolutionary selection of what image wins and gains consensus that we all form around too. And even like when we're talking about Mars, like as a sci-fi fan, I like immediately go to think about like Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, and there's, you know, a very interesting like rich debate between the different factions in that story. The people that are for a red Mars that are very conservationist in the sense of like we should not change the planet, and then there's the green Mars people who are like it's our job to proliferate life and we should terraform the planet. And those are both kind of environmental arguments in different ways too, that have different ethical systems, and it like literally comes to blows over that. And so like even like saying that we need a creative director and a vision for Mars, like there's a process to go from that like need to like a single vision that people can actually unite around. But I'm kind of curious about how you're imagining like that evolution, like like happening between now and then? Because when I actually look at your some of the prompts and the dynamics that you're kind of like encouraging us, we don't repeat the mistakes of last time. I think probably the answer is maybe not one vision, but like a multitude of visions too. And I'm curious about just to hear about more of how you're seeing that evolve.
Well, I think the starting point is like part of the reason why we did this talk is like there's one person that talks about Mars extensively, and that's Elon. And part of this talk is just like us leveling Elon to our level. Like, yeah, now guess what? You have competition now. Like there's at minimum 2 visions for Mars, and and I think that's really important because once you have 2 visions for something, then there will always be 50. Like it takes one person to copy like something, and then there's 50 versions. And you're just like, yo, how did that happen? And so I think part of this talk was allowing us the room and space to say like, no, we actually have a like philosophical framework to approach this thing, and it doesn't just look like Elon co-opting the language. Because I also think he's not really creative directing it; he's just kind of stating it, and I think that's a lot of the frustration as well. So, yeah, Elon.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, like this talk is like really about creating a job listing for something we don't have a right to create a job listing for. But like the premise is like there will be multiple, and like that might be a job. Like in 10 or 20 years, like if you're like a kid now like studying or whatever, it's like you might actually be working on these things. And so the next like 10, 20 years is like that's like CV building for when those jobs come up. But like yeah, it's really about creating a competitive market, like push all the ideas out, and the best ones will win. But like what I guess the point what we're saying is that there are no markets to expand into at the moment. And so that's what we really mean is like we're creating that vessel for that market to happen. And yeah, you might get that job one day. I don't know if we'll be able to give it to you though, but someone will.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really good example of just like, if this sounds ridiculous, just like in 2018, Luca and I ran around like SF saying metaverse and everyone laughed at us. And now like everyone's the creative directing some metaverse startup. And for some like, just putting things out in the open, like yesterday there was a dinner with like the CEO of like Balenciaga, Gucci, all in San Francisco for metaverse strategy. So like clearly, people think like the metaverse is big enough to like have all these creative director roles, and these people with like very large systems of production and capital are taking it very seriously. And I think Mars is probably doubly serious, and we'll need 50 creative directors for. And these same people, like the job now is not like, oh, I'm Demna at Balenciaga and that's the end of my career, but it's more like I'm Demna at Balenciaga and now it's like, okay, well now I have to be Demna at insert space company that doesn't exist yet. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's adding a new cultural layer to what is the peak for a little bit at least until we make a new boat.
So I'm curious about your perspective about relationship between story and image, right? You could say, well, story is part of image, image is part of story, story is the boat, image is the boat, or story equal to image. So I'm just curious about your perspective.
Yeah, I think they're deeply intertwined. Like by image, we are referring to story in a way. I guess like the story is really like the byproduct of pursuing an image, and so it's really about an image that creates a certain trajectory for us to move towards. That really becomes the story. And I think what's interesting about images is that the first few people who believe in an image and start to pursue it, it just creates that momentum. And that momentum building is what a story is. That's what I think it is. It's the hero's journey. It's a complete arc. That's what we're really looking to create here. And so images are almost like the trigger to kick those stories off. Yeah.
The image is the boat and the story is the ripples.
Why does it matter that Mars is a physical place?
It doesn't. Or wait.
In relation to all of your vocabulary, we can do those things on Earth. We can do those things in the metaverse. Why does it matter that Mars is a physical place that you can go to?
Oh, yeah. Because it's bigger. Like, it's literally just a question of scale. Like, we need Mars as an understanding that there is something bigger than the internet. The problem with the metaverse is just trying to, like, restructure the internet in its, like, sensibility. And there's, like, new rules and new design principles and new philosophical principles, and that's all well and good. But it actually doesn't break us out of what it is to be online. It's just going deeper into like that fun house, which is I'm a proponent for. Like Eternal exists, but it's important. It's a physical place because it's so distinctly it's undeniable in its size, and then because it's undeniable in its size, it creates that mirror back to everything that we're doing here.
Oh, I agree with you. I'm just wondering how we explain that to the rest of the world.
I think it's also easy to forget how much our world is still deeply physical. And I think whilst there's a kind of euphoria around everything being digitized now, like, you know, fundamentally, like the sort of key constructs of identity are still ultimately deriving from land masses. And like that's kind of why we picked Mars, is that it's sort of a total holistic shift from everything we have. The metaverse is just sort of based on the internet as a kind of thing to change, but this is really like a full, you know, like we have a completely new space to map things onto. And so, you know, that's what I think it is. It's like we can't forget how sort of viscerally engaged we are still with the physical world and how important that is. So I think it is important that it's physical. I think what's important is actually that it's both, you know.
So I like that you brought up metaverse. Sorry, I lost my voice on Tuesday, so I'm trying here. As you're talking about boats and places, in a place we haven't yet been to, would it be fair? So you think about the place we're at now to the place that we're going to go to. We're always going to bring the bias or the experience that we have here and supplant it there, right? To your point about that Mars isn't going to be as awesome as we're describing, right? Do we need the metaverse? We needed the internet to get to the conversation you guys are bringing up in terms of what's the word I'm thinking of? Stripping down our old bias, right? So do we need to get to metaverse to get to a better version of what Mars could be?
Yeah, that's
like we need to experience that first.
I would say no, because we already have the internet, and the internet is like that form of globalization. Now we're just tinkering with it. So like Kevin Kelly has this thing in What Technology Wants that talks about technology reflects itself back at us so that we can continually tinker with it. Like we reached a pretty global internet, and now we're tinkering with it, and like that real big next step is the metaverse, right? The important thing that you were talking about with like supplanting our biases as humans with flaws and spirits going to Mars. We had in the Figma, there's this photo of Andre 3000, and he's wearing a jumpsuit, and on the jumpsuit it says something like, people of darker skin colors suffer more across all societies. Why? And I think the kind of post-national and the fluid identity parts of our design principles really speak to why, if that's not rooted in Mars, we will learn from those previous mistakes. We're not saying that it's easy, but at the same time, there's more black people that are here today that were not here yesterday. And I think, you know, just holding space for that sense of fluid identity and fluid community construction is what gives us a better chance. But that's also why Mars is not utopia, but something to really strive for as a non-inevitability and what that might solve here.
If I can ask a second question, it maybe relates to the first question that we had from Matt, but in the Long Now Foundation, there's this idea of being a good ancestor. I wonder what you would think of being a good pilgrim, or whatever the people who are going to be those people going to Mars. What's your idea of that, if you have one?
Yeah, so this kind of ties back to our point that like the big ethical win of going to Mars from all the rovers that we've sent there is like no one's there right now. So we're already off to a better footing, right? Because we're not like displacing natives and saying like mine. And that's like non-trivially important. So I think we're already starting off as like, you know, ethical V2 pilgrims to this space. I think what's going to be good about Mars from a pilgrimage standpoint is that the spawn point is global. And so I think what it looks like is keeping the internet as a spawn point and not one nation or not one guy. I think the immediate flaw would be if the first rover to Mars was just like 5 white dudes from SpaceX, like bad pilgrims, immediate bad pilgrims. You know what I mean? Good pilgrims is just like, all right, like we're gonna have the Olympics and we're gonna take like it has to like have almost like a World's Fair competitiveness like structure to who's going first. And then on top of that, you know, Founders Fund did this like really funny, like really long thing Mike Solana did. And something they said was just like, oh, like, you know, probably the first people might have to be like poly because they're gonna be like less jealous because there will be divorces and there will be frustrations and people. And like, it was a really interesting probe of just like, oh yeah, like what happens when like, you know, you catch your like partner sleeping with someone else and then you go berserk on the ship and like kill everyone. Immediate pilgrimage probe like done, right? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of these, you know, design principles and probes that we have to ask ourselves and like the real reality of what it means to be human in a tight confine for a period of time and then in a new land really frustrated for a period of time. But ethically, we're on a lot better standards already, which is good.
Maybe it's good that it'll take us a long time to get there because there's still a lot of stuff that we need to process to get to the imagined Mars that I think you guys are describing, right?
Yeah, like with that first kind of diagram, you know, showing how the last kind of boat we sent out was globalization from a point of basically, you know, industrial period Europe about 150, 200 years ago. You know, that kind of gives us an idea roughly of the time scale of what we're talking about, which is this is not like, I mean, definitely this will have an impact, you know, very soon, I think very, very imminently. But this is, don't get me wrong, like 150, 200 year project. Like this is going to take a long time. I think the best thing we can do is accept that we're not perfect and there is no utopian sort of dramatic utopian change that has overcome us when we start to think about Mars. Like understanding, though, we are still human. We're going to make mistakes. I think that's key. And I think over time, like as long as we're honest with each other in that conversation over, you know, 150, 200 years, I think, you know, the outcome will be as intersectional as it could be, hopefully. You know, I think that's the goal.
This is like a little half-formed, but I think like one of the things that's really coming up for me around all of this is like the power of a boat or an image to create a new or a different politics, like a small p politics. I think I don't know whether it's small p or big P, but sort of like a new framing of politics. And I think you guys kind of like skipped over the surface of that in the presentation, but like would love to hear you talk more about how you think about that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely political. I think the only reason that we're not sending people up to Mars right now is because of politics. Like, you know, we went to the moon so long ago, and then we stopped, and that was political. It's like the same way Vietnam was political, you know. And so it's just like we have rovers there. We know how to get there. We can operate shit over there. It's just like those are all political decisions. And then I think it gets into like the human political, right? And so, like I said, like the failure of like the first immigrants to Mars would be 5 white dudes in a ship. But like that's going to be a decision that happens here with our politics now, right? And that could happen if people are brave enough and like no one stopped it. We could do that tomorrow. Like there's literally no reason we couldn't. And so we know our political issues right now. We're living through a current political issue, you know, not to like change the entire course of this talk, but yeah, I think that this again really hinges on the design principles of being post nation state, being post language, embracing fluid identity, like realizing. I'm not gonna say that one, but yeah, embracing those things, like. I think when we talk about principles, like it's something to live by and it's something to build a charter around. And if the first ship doesn't have that charter with it, failure. Or like the second ship should really land on the other side of Mars and just compete. You know what I mean? And that's why there needs to be 20 creative directors, because those political image will transfer to some degree. And that is going to be like highly expansive and interesting.
Whenever people talk about Mars, I always have some questions about why Mars, because I feel like the human beings already destroyed the planet Earth. Sayu, why do you want to move to another planet and possibly destroy another one? So the question I'm having is, why don't you think people should focus on solving the problems we have in our community, in our nation, or in the world, but rather spend energy and resources on something that may take 200 years or 500 years if we ever get there?
Yep. So, I mean, I think I probably philosophically disagree with the statement that we've destroyed Earth. But this is about the mirror. This is about thinking larger and creating images that will solve these things as byproducts. And so if you fundamentally disagree with that probe, then there's kind of like nowhere to go, right, conversationally between us. But if you can like start to like be like, okay, maybe Mars is an interesting mirror, then like what is going to be necessary on Mars? Well, we're gonna have to grow our own food. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, it has to be in a lot more sustainable and like unique way than we're doing it on Earth. Immediately, we start to look at the way that we farm on Earth differently. Okay, we're going to Mars. What does that team look like? Well, it's 2 black women, it's 1 Asian woman, it's like 2 Indian guys, and it's like 1 gay white guy, right? Like now, immediately, got you. And so immediately, you know, we start to look at, well, how come our other power systems don't look like this? Thinking about the politics of home. And so we can just do this for every single thing that we need. And I guarantee you the byproduct is solving those things. But for some reason, the current system that says, oh, like, how come we don't, you know, fix these things on Earth? It's just like, look at the images you're making. They're not interested. I'm not interested in them. I don't care about them. The kids don't. Like, the dopest thing right now is like a 24-year-old like hot girl on TikTok talking about nuclear energy. She's gonna be the new legislator on nuclear energy, something that y'all have had the opportunity to do for a really long time. France like works on 75% nuclear. Why don't we? Why are we in this conflict? Why are we in all these conflicts? Because the images y'all make suck. Like, that's the youth culture answer for you. The images y'all make suck. Mars is a better image, and it's gonna solve these things in a far more interesting way.
Amazing place to end. Thank you, Reggie and Eugene.